This episode contains descriptions of spiritual abuse, manipulation, and narcissistic leadership behavior in a church setting. Some of the accounts may be distressing, especially for listeners who have experienced religious trauma or coercive leadership environments. Please listen with care, and if you need support, we've included a list of resources at spoiledfruitpodcast.com/resources. Now let's begin. Before he ever stepped foot in California, Alan Scott had already built a name for himself across the Atlantic. He and his wife Kathryn co-led Causeway Coast Vineyard in Coleraine, Northern Ireland, one of the most influential churches in the UK vineyard world. Kathryn, a worship leader, was well known for her music. Songs like Hungry and At the Foot of the Cross became staples of vineyard worship in the early 2000s. And Alan? He branded himself as a revivalist, a man of prophetic vision, the kind of leader who could turn a prayer meeting of 6 into a megachurch of thousands.
Yeah, I think some people may have heard of Kathryn Scott because she's also a musician, so they may have heard her songs. He's originally from Scotland, but they built a really big mega church in Northern Ireland called Causeway Coast Vineyard. And it's kind of known for, kind of his thing is that he grew up from 6 people to this huge mega church.
That kind of exponential growth put Alan Scott on the radar of vineyard leadership around the world. But what didn't follow him, at least not publicly, was the past. Because before Northern Ireland, there was Scotland. And before the platform, there was scandal.
Find with these leaders that go as far as people like Alan go, just in general, they don't just kind of drop out of the sky and start spiritually abusing people. But it can be interesting because there can be stuff that happened decades ago that at that time might have even been somewhat public, or at least known to that community, that just does not get into the public record. It doesn't follow them to the next place in any kind of transparent way.
Alan Scott's earliest church leadership experience came alongside his brother John, who pastored a vineyard church in Scotland. But in the early 2000s, Alan's brother was involved in an inappropriate relationship with a woman in the church. The scandal forced John to resign, and Alan, though not officially on staff, was brought in as a lay leader to help manage the fallout.
So, as early as back in Scotland, and this is in the kind of this original piece that I wrote on this, there were some problems. So he grew up in Scotland. He and his brother got connected with a church that became Vineyard, and his brother ended up pastoring this church. Well, his brother ended up having an inappropriate relationship with a woman in their church. Alan at this time, he was kind of in and out. He was going to Bible school, got married during this time, but he was like a lay leader, like a non-professional leader in the church with his brother, which is kind of a common theme for Alan. There's a lot of family, at least in Scotland and Northern Ireland, there's family connections in the churches there. Which, doesn't necessarily mean it's a bad thing, but it can be a little bit hard for accountability. Your brother is not going to really try to turn you in and hold your feet to the fire usually. But anyway, so John has this inappropriate relationship. Alan, as this leader in the church at the time, according to the sources that told me, he is kind of tasked with dealing with the fallout.
Even at that early stage, Alan was drawing criticism. Multiple sources from that time described him as manipulative, controlling, and resistant to transparency.
Anyway, and so even from that point, there was some documentation that came out from that showed people weren't happy even with Alan's leadership at the time. They felt like he was manipulative, controlling, really not really trying to be very transparent with this.
And then, shortly after the incident, Alan left Scotland, not to step back, but to step up. He relocated to Coleraine, Northern Ireland, where he and Kathryn would take over Causeway Coast Vineyard, right on the heels of that unresolved scandal.
It's kind of interesting to think about it. The narrative is he grew this church from, 6 to, probably thousands. But also there's this part of the story that I'm guessing most people did not know, that he had just come out of this scandal with his brother.
And in Coleraine, Alan's leadership patterns didn't change. If anything, they scaled. In Coleraine, the Scotts took over Causeway Coast Vineyard and quickly turned it into one of the fastest growing churches in the UK. Alan's message was simple: God is moving here, and if you want to be part of it, you need to step up. But behind the revival language was a growing pattern of control.
And then, sure enough, in Causeway Coast, the manipulation, the control continued. A lot of it because of wanting to grow it. And so putting pressure on people to have these really big God stories, and maybe not always super true, or just, the main point is you have to get out and have these really big conversion stories.
Staff and volunteers were pressured to deliver dramatic testimonies and public displays of spiritual victory. But when the miraculous didn't come, you had to make it sound like it did. Alan also cultivated a mystique around his own spirituality, claiming divine knowledge about the people around him.
Also, he had a very godlike presence, and he cultivated that. It wasn't just that, people admired what he had to say and felt like he was wise toward what God would say, but that he was very much like, I know what sin you have in your heart. And God tells me what you say about me in your house.
That statement, God tells me what you say about me in your house, came up repeatedly in the investigation commissioned by Causeway Coast years later. After Alan left, the church hired a third-party firm, Trusted HR, to investigate allegations of spiritual abuse and toxic leadership. What they found was disturbing. The report documented a pattern of manipulation, domination, and fear. Former staff and volunteers described a performance-based culture driven by revival expectations. Individuals were pushed to fabricate testimonies of healing or salvation. Those who resisted or questioned leadership were sidelined or removed. The report also noted that Alan claimed supernatural insight into staff members' private lives and used that claim to elevate some and discredit others. In one especially invasive example, Alan reportedly declared that masturbation was spiritually disqualifying, and then required a young man seeking a leadership position to confess his entire sexual history, including past masturbation during a one-on-one meeting. The man described feeling humiliated and spiritually coerced, pressured to expose private details to satisfy Alan's expectations of purity and submission. It was framed as discernment, but it functioned as control. Trusted HR concluded that the leadership style at Causeway Coast under Alan Scott was deeply unhealthy and had caused lasting harm to those who served under it. And yet, there were no consequences, no removal, no public reckoning. Alan left on his own terms, wrapped in prophecy, claiming God had called him to California.
I think the investigation happened after he moved to California, if I understand it right. Which means he leaves Causeway Coast, he gets to have a narrative where God told him to do this big thing in America, or at least to go to America. But behind the scenes, there's all these people he has hurt there too. Whether they're talking about it to each other, is a little bit unclear, but certainly things weren't just going swimmingly there. There were problems there as well.
And so he left one stage for another. And what happened next would make history. In 2017, Alan and Kathryn Scott moved from Northern Ireland to Southern California. Not because they'd accepted a job offer, but because, as Alan would later claim, God told them to go. They had no pastoral position lined up, no formal invitation, and no clear plan. Just a sense of prophetic calling. But within a year, they had connected with leaders at Vineyard Anaheim, the flagship church of the movement Alan had already begun distancing himself from. And before long, he was applying for the senior pastor role vacated by longtime leader Lance Pitluck. At the time, Vineyard Anaheim was struggling. Financial pressures reportedly forced the sale of a third of its property. Attendance had declined steadily over time, and the COVID-19 pandemic had only deepened the challenge. Alan Scott known for growing Causeway Coast Vineyard from a small prayer group to a massive church, seemed like a godsend. But what followed would leave many wondering whether Alan's calling to California had always included something more than ministry. When the dust began to settle in early 2022, Anaheim Vineyard was no longer a vineyard at all. It had been renamed the Dwelling Place. The Scotts were fully in control, and $62 million in assets, much of it built by decades of giving from faithful vineyard members, was now permanently severed from the movement. Vineyard USA issued a public statement expressing grief, but behind the scenes, there was little they could do. The board structure had given local churches near total autonomy, and autonomy, in this case, had backfired. Across the country and around the world, the vineyard community watched in disbelief. Longtime members of Anaheim felt betrayed. Former pastors and staff from Northern Ireland who had previously raised red flags began to see eerie patterns repeating themselves. Some of them, for the first time, started speaking publicly.
Yeah, I mean, I think it shocked everybody, including staff. So he came in with like he's gonna grow Vineyard Anaheim. He's gonna kind of save it from its maybe possibly dwindling state was kind of the narrative, right? So he puts all this pressure on staff. There's some things that are coming out that aren't great either. 2020 happens. This big plan to really grow it is now in question. Churches are not doing great as far as numbers. 21, he tells some staff that God has prophesied that in a couple years, the church is going to have 20,000 people in it, like this huge number, right? And they're already under a lot of pressure. And that's kind of where some of the toxicity comes. And he's trying to purify it, but in a really weird way and really not great way. And then, early 2022, all of a sudden, he tells, Vineyard USA leaders, we're pulling out. And, the staff is shocked. The Vineyard USA is shocked. There's kind of this implication that the board is on board with him, like his board is on board. But again, he's already kind of pushed out the people that were not the yes people.
Hopkins, an investigative journalist with the Roy's Report, was one of the few to begin piecing the story together. First in Coleraine, then in Anaheim.
So and as far as I know, one thing I didn't quite ever get the piece of is why he left Causeway Coast. I mean, yes, God told him apparently, but I mean, was there anything else, right?
It's a fair question, because just like in Coleraine, Alan left right as pressure and scrutiny began to rise. And just like in Coleraine, he created a tightly controlled leadership culture filled with spiritualized language and unspoken expectations. In Anaheim, staff meetings reportedly included teaching about body types that Alan used to screen leadership candidates. One body type in particular, type 3, described as having a larger torso and thinner legs, was said to represent people who were power-hungry, defiant, and ultimately disloyal. Alan didn't want type 3s on his staff, and according to recordings obtained by the Roy's Report, he made that clear.
But he does this thing where he talks to staff kind of in staff meetings about body types. Okay, so from what we can tell, just like the materials, the teaching materials, he gets it seems, from Jim McNeish. I'm not sure if that's how you say his name, but he's Scottish. And he has this like body type system. I think there's 5 numbers. I can't remember. But, every body type is associated with a personality. So tall and thin would be something, and then short would be this. And so the body type, according to like staff meetings that we have these recordings of, that he doesn't like he does not want this body type on his staffing, is type 3. So this is somebody that has a larger torso and thin legs. And apparently their personality would be that they're power hungry, difficult to control, just not going to fit in, that kind of thing. And so he kind of works to, according to these sources, he works to push out people who fit that body type. And I mean, it's weird. Oh, and speaking of like other famous musicians, so another person that he has there is Noah DeBolt, who's a drummer, especially like at that time, like he was growing, his influence and reach church was really growing. He's a drummer, but his wife apparently is body type 3, according to, Alan. And so they get pushed out. And yeah, it got so weird. There's this one quote from one of the staff meetings that we got the recording of that he talks about that type 3 are the ones who sow the seeds of demise.
In early 2022, Alan Scott made the announcement. Anaheim Vineyard, the flagship church founded by John Wimber, was no longer part of the Vineyard movement. They weren't planning something new. They weren't aligning with a different denomination. They were just leaving. Quietly, without warning, without a vote. The reaction was immediate and stunned. Many in the broader Vineyard community were shocked. Longtime members of Anaheim felt blindsided. And even the staff, those closest to the Scotts, had no idea the change was coming. Former staff member Bradley Andrews says he learned the church had disaffiliated from Vineyard via a phone call. Not a staff meeting, not a prayer gathering, a phone call. Triggered by the fact that word of the split was starting to leak. And in that call, staff were told the decision had already been made. They were reminded that Anaheim was part of an association, not a denomination, and that leaving wouldn't really change anything. They were told the disassociation was driven by 4 specific limitations the Vineyard structure imposed: missions, church planting, worship, and compassion. The message was carefully framed. This was about freedom, flexibility, and calling. Not rebellion, not empire building. Nothing was supposed to change. But then came Alan's announcement to the congregation. And this time, the reasons changed too. There were no categories, no missional strategy, no practical rationale. Just this: God told me to. The abruptness of it all left many in the congregation and the staff deeply confused. Who had approved this? Who was even on the board? And as details slowly emerged, the board was revealed to include Alan and Kathryn Scott, Jeremy and Katie Riddle, Julian Adams, Greg Shearer, Peter Grigg, and Banning Leibscher. It was a board handpicked by Alan. But unlike traditional church governance, it didn't represent the congregation. Some members weren't local, some weren't part of Anaheim. And at least one, Banning Leibscher, wasn't even part of the Vineyard movement. Leibscher, the founder of Jesus Culture, is closely connected to Bethel Church in Redding, California. He's part of a very different theological world, one built around music, media, and massive platform influence. It raised questions Vineyard leaders had no good answers for. Why was the board composed of high-profile figures rather than local members? Was this about spiritual leadership or strategic brand alignment? Was Alan Scott looking at the success of Bethel and Jesus Culture and asking himself, why not me? Not long after the disassociation, the backlash began. Carol Wimber Wong, widow of Vineyard founder John Wimber, joined a group of former Anaheim leaders in filing a lawsuit. The allegation? Fraud and misrepresentation. That Alan and Kathryn Scott had taken control of church assets under false pretenses, while promising, during the hiring process, that they were Vineyard through and through, and would never leave. The assets in question? Reportedly over $62 million. That included an estimated $55 million in real estate and $7 million in liquid cash. But in the end, the courts declined to intervene. They ruled that under the First Amendment, they couldn't interfere in matters of church governance. It was a spiritual dispute, not a legal one. So the assets stayed with the Scotts. The dwelling place stayed independent. And Vineyard USA, again, was left empty-handed.
There can be complicity in these situations. And so I feel like that's probably been maybe even underreported. I mean, a lot of times it's easy to kind of eventually find, the bad guy, right? but then everybody kind of wants to pull away and be like, oh, we had no idea. We didn't know. Oh. But a lot of times they did know at least some red flags and some initial reports. And also it's possible they've contributed to like a systemic problem that has allowed that particular quality. Like if you are in a denomination where numbers is your metric for success and you've cultivated that mindset, and then you have a pastor comes in and kind of takes it to, the nth degree where he'll just run, throw people under the bus for the sake of numbers success. Well, it's probably not just that guy, right? Like he's been supported in that mindset and in that process. And that's that kind of work, though, the culture work, I guess, it's a lot harder to do. It's a lot harder to change. I feel like that's where the really important change happens. And that's where the change that a lot of whistleblowers would love to see happen. Like, please just get to the foundational stuff. Please don't just get rid of this one guy, but get to the foundational stuff, I think is what they're just like craving to see. But it is so hard to happen because people just want to protect themselves. They want to protect, the reputation of the organization. They find all these different ways, like attorney-client privilege, to hide how they handled things instead of really being transparent about how they handled every step of the way.
Churches leave the Vineyard movement all the time. It's not rare, and it's not necessarily scandalous. Under Vineyard's governance model, local churches are autonomous. That means if they disassociate, they keep their building. They keep their assets. Vineyard USA doesn't get the keys. It's part of the deal. But what made this moment different wasn't just the policy, it was the optics. This wasn't any church. This was John Wimber's church. The church where the Vineyard movement was born. The church where Wimber built the DNA that would go on to influence tens of thousands of pastors, leaders, and worship teams around the world. And now, it belonged to someone else. Not just legally, but ideologically. Alan Scott hadn't just taken control, he had started crafting something entirely new. We don't know exactly what motivated the decision to leave the Vineyard, but we do know this. Alan Scott is a man driven by platform. In Northern Ireland, he was known for emphasizing growth, story, and spectacle. He pushed for big public God moments. He built a church from a few people into a crowd of thousands. And in Anaheim, he came in with similar ambition.
So he came in with like, he's gonna grow Vineyard Anaheim. He's gonna kind of save it from its maybe possibly dwindling state was kind of the narrative, right? So he puts all this pressure on staff. There's some things that are coming out that aren't great either. 2020 happens. This big plan to really grow it is now in question. Churches are not doing great as far as numbers. 21, he tells some staff that God has prophesied that in a couple years, the church is going to have 20,000 people in it. Like this huge number, right?
20,000 people. That wasn't a goal, that was a prophecy. And Alan didn't pursue that goal alone. He surrounded himself with leaders affiliated with Bethel Church, the charismatic megachurch in Redding, California, known for its music, media empire, and supernatural brand. He brought in Jeremy Riddle, a former Bethel worship leader. He added Banning Leibscher, the founder of Jesus Culture, to his board. And you start to wonder, was he trying to recreate Bethel in Southern California? After all, Bethel is doing now what Vineyard was doing in the 1990s. Massive music streaming numbers, worship tours, a hyper-charismatic, emotionally immersive brand of Christianity. Could it be that Alan saw that as the future, and the Vineyard as a fading brand? But there's another pattern worth considering. Alan left Scotland after a scandal involving his brother, a fellow church leader. He left Northern Ireland before the trusted HR investigation was complete, and he disaffiliated from Vineyard USA just as more allegations about his leadership style were beginning to surface. It raises the question, does Alan Scott leave when the heat gets too high? Because today, he's no longer accountable to Vineyard leadership. There's no national movement above him, no outside board, no independent review. He has crafted his own system, his own board, his own movement, in his own image. And the irony? He did it inside the very building John Wimber once used to guide the Vineyard movement. The lawsuit filed by Carol Wimber Wong and other former leaders is still ongoing. But as of now, the church, now called Dwelling Place, remains firmly in the hands of Alan and Kathryn Scott. And what did Carol and the others get? Not the church, not the money, not a seat at the table, just a statue of Jesus washing the feet of Peter, a bronze sculpture called Divine Servant that had been gifted to John and Carol in 1993 and once stood in the foyer of the church that bore their legacy. After the disassociation, it was quietly returned to the Wimber family. A symbol of servant leadership, returned to the ones who had built a movement, by those who walked away from it. What happens when you give your life to a movement? Preach its sermons, plant its churches, sing its songs, only to discover that there are lines you're not allowed to cross. In the next chapter of Spoiled Fruit, we'll tell the story of Ken Wilson, a founding pastor who believed that the Vineyard movement could be big enough for everyone. But when he stepped forward to affirm LGBTQ+ inclusion, he wasn't given a conversation, he was given a warning, and eventually, a door. He wasn't the only one. We'll hear from pastors across the country who stayed faithful to Vineyard theology and practice, but who were quietly pushed out when they challenged the status quo. Because in Vineyard, you can raise the dead. You just can't raise certain questions. Spoiled Fruit, Faith and Power is an independent investigative podcast. The views and opinions expressed in this series are based on publicly available information, first-hand interviews, and credible sources. While every effort has been made to ensure accuracy, listeners are encouraged to do their own research. All subjects are presumed innocent unless proven otherwise in a court of law. This podcast does not offer legal advice, nor is it affiliated with Vineyard USA or any of the churches or organizations mentioned. If you or someone you know has experienced abuse, spiritual manipulation, or harm in a faith context, support resources are available at spoiledfruitpodcast.com/resources.
Shopify is a global commerce platform that helps you sell at every stage of your business and sell more with less effort thanks to the Shopify Magic, your AI-powered all-star. Sign up for a $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/redcircle, all lowercase. Go to shopify.com/redcircle now to grow your business no matter what stage you're in. Shopify.com/redcircle.